colleague, collaborator, and dear friend of mine, Dr. Jasper Van Assche, all the way from Belgium. Dr. Van Assche is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Developmental, Personality, and Social Psychology at Ghent University in Belgium, and also a lecturer at the Center for Social and Cultural Psychology at the, and I've practiced this, I'm going to try and say it, Université Libre de Bruxelles. Yes, is that right?
Yeah.
He completed his doctoral dissertation in 2018, and since then, he has already authored or co-authored 50 peer-reviewed publications, which is very impressive. Jasper is the associate editor of the Journal of Social and Political Psychology and has received the Belgian Association for Psychological Sciences Best PhD Award in 2019 and the Prix de Psychologie awarded by the Belgian Royal Academy for Best Doctoral Dissertation in Psychological Sciences between 2016 and 2018. So a very accomplished young academic. His research deals with the role of diversity in society, political attitudes, intergroup relations, and prejudice. And I am especially excited to hear what you have to share with us today. Jasper, we will have Jasper do his presentation, present his work, and then I will facilitate some questions afterwards, both from the room and from the online audience. Jasper, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Herman, for those very, very kind words. And thank you also for having me here. It's not my first time in South Africa, but still, I always like coming here, especially this area. Has many things to offer. So good to see you all in person. And what I'll talk about today, the title here is A Critical Look at Intergroup Relations in and Outside of South Africa. I will try to take you on a bit of a journey, like some of the work that I have done before and how it's related to other work of people, for example, from this country. I'll try to say a lot of things, and I only have 45 minutes, so I might go a bit fast, but tell me if things are unclear. I'm more than welcome to take any questions. So what I'll start with is the basic idea of my PhD project, which was about ethnic diversity and intergroup attitudes. And basically, my main question was, how do people react to diversity in their environment? How do we operationalize diversity to begin with? Well, a definition is the relative proportion of people of other social groups in a given area. In South Africa, for example, this could be ethnic groups, but it doesn't have to be necessarily that, although most of my research is focused on ethnic and cultural diversity as such. This is an oversimplification of how two fictitious neighborhoods could look like. And as you see, for example, for white people, there is low diversity here on the left, whereas on the right, there is a higher proportion, at least, of houses of people from other backgrounds. So we're going to talk about in and out group attitudes along the way. I think most of you are familiar with social psychology and the study of intergroup relations, so I'll use those terms then. When we look at ethnic diversity, we don't know the answer, is it good or bad, but we know that there's at least a lot of polarization on this question. And I just give you a few snippets of what I read in newspapers. And on the left, for example, you can see very extremely negative views on diversity. Also, often dehumanizing words that are used to describe people coming to, for example, Western European countries. Europe is divided literally. But on the other hand, we can also see like welcoming attitudes and a lot of positivity and tolerance towards people with migration background, for example. And you can see on the right, diversity is seen as a strength, or we should like enhance or attract immigrants to the country to prosper. So these views already show that there's a lot going on this topic. And what I will do is actually describe a bit of the research that has been done in the past, let's say, 15 to 20 years on this topic. I'll start with Robert Putnam. I don't know if you know him. He's a political scientist from the United States who's had a big impact specifically on this field. He's very famous. Like when Obama was president, Obama invited him to discuss about where the United States could go to actually make a multicultural, diverse society work. So he has had a lot of impact, at least in the political field, but also in the academic field, because in 2007, he published a well-cited paper, A Pluribus Unum, of many, one, and where he proposed a construct claim. And the construct claim basically said diversity is bad for intergroup attitudes, or for attitudes along the way. This is also called the hunkering down hypothesis, and I call it the turtle theory because he literally says that people pull in like a turtle when they are in diverse environments. So if you live in a neighborhood with a lot of people that are different from you, he showed that there's social isolation, so people literally stay in their houses, they don't go out anymore, there's just no connections with the neighbors. There's less trust, and less trust across all domains. So generalized trust, but also out-group trust, but even surprisingly, in-group trust as well. So in a diverse environment, you don't even trust people from your own ethnic cultural group, for example. And he uses the words bridging and bonding capital along the way, and he says like ethnic diversity destroys these two types of capital and social cohesion at large. So really, this paper was a bomb. Like people were wondering, okay, what does this mean? On a critical note, he also said that these are the effects on the short run, and he proposed that there should be longitudinal studies to look at the long-term impact, of course, of diversity as well. But Putnam shook the field and was a big earthquake, and a lot of studies have followed since that year looking at this question.
So sorry, Jasper.
Yes?
I don't think that they've seen the slides change.
Oh,
so can I
okay.
just...
Yeah, they can see me and hear me.
They can
online?
see and
Okay.
hear you. I think yeah, so there we go. So they are on this one. There we go. So sorry.
No, don't worry.
That's fine.
Is this better?
This is better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. I see that it's not really visible, but what I will present here are some tables that two Dutch colleagues made in 2014. So 7 years later, there were already over 90 papers that were published, or working papers, on this specific topic. You can see actually that it started a little bit earlier than that as well, but still, these are all post-Putnam papers that try to test the hunkering down hypothesis. And there, Van der Meer and Tolsma really wanted to nuance this debate by showing that actually it depends a lot on where you look at to find evidence of this. In general, only 1/3 of the studies found evidence for the construct claim, 1/3 found actually mixed evidence, a bit supporting, a bit rejecting, and 1/3 even rejected it completely, showed opposites effect, that diversity is actually promising and positive. So you can already see a mix of evidence, diverse attitudes in these diverse relationships. And in these tables, well, I will show you some of the most important parts. For example, these researchers show that it's important to look at the target. When looking at in-group attitudes or in-group trust, you can see that only 1 in 5 of the studies find evidence for the fact that diversity would be related to lower in-group trust. When you look at out-group trust, it's only 9%, so only 1 in 10 studies supports this, well, critical finding. It also depends on the location, and that's where I want to go towards, because a lot of these studies are done in the US, almost 50% of the post-Putnam studies, which is logical because it was the paper started from there as well. But there's a lot of studies also in Western Europe and around the world. And it also depends a lot. In Europe, for example, only 1 in 4 studies find evidence for the construct claim, whereas in the US, it's about 50%. So it really depends on where you look at. And finally, there's this debate called the level of analysis debate that also shows, like, if we find negative consequences, it's usually in closer areas, like in neighborhoods, not really in cities, and definitely not on the country level. Probably because we have our day-to-day experiences in our neighborhoods, on our streets, for example, if you go to the bakery or a bar. And there, I think, are the biggest effects of who's surrounding you. You can live, for example, in a homogeneous neighborhood in a diverse country, but you wouldn't be affected by that diversity of the areas that you're not living in. So there's been a meta-analysis as well. This is not a meta-analysis, it's more like a critical review, reporting like descriptives like who finds evidence, who doesn't. There's been a meta-analysis now by two Scandinavian scholars, Dinesen and CESCUP, recently, and they try to put like numbers, and their effects are like -0.02, -0.01, depending if you look at generalized in-group or out-group trust. So basically, in general, not really an effect. So if you start from the Putnam theory or the turtle theory, saying like that diversity is a bad idea, basically the literature shows on average, diversity really doesn't change things. But I will show that underneath this zero correlation or almost zero correlation, there's a polarization going on. And the best way to show what polarization is, or the polarization theory that we proposed a couple of years ago, is to look at these graphs of Democrat and Republic opinions on a certain theme. For example, here it's about immigration. Is this a good idea or not? What you can see is along the way, like in 1994, there was some difference, but most people actually, there's a lot of overlap as well. This overlap slowly disappears, and in 2014, opinions became much more polarized than 20 years before that. So it really shows that we are moving towards more extreme ends. And I really want to have this discussion as well with you later on, because the political context, for example, in the States, there's a multi-party system, but actually in reality, there's only two parties. In Belgium, for example, the political platform is very diverse. There's like about 8 political parties, and they also have like the Dutch and the French-speaking variations. In South Africa, I don't know, 28, I think, official parties, basically also reflecting like the two most popular ones, ANC and DA. But I'm wondering, like in your context, do you see this polarization as well? So I'm hoping to talk a bit about that later. So basically, the polarization theory says that there's diverse reactions to diversity. Not everyone is equally what I call sensitive to the diversity around them. And I'll propose to you a key term, and I don't know if people are familiar with authoritarianism as a construct, which is basically a facet of social cultural conservatism. And it has like 3 sub-factors or dimensions that are all showing submission to authorities. These authorities can be leaders of a country, for example. These could be the norms and values of society, so those people really submit to traditional values and conventionalism. And then the third factor is also aggression or negativity towards people that deviate from those norms. And you can already clearly see here that diversity might be perceived as a threat, especially for people that are authoritarian, because they feel like, okay, newcomers, new cultures, that there's a clash between that, and I don't feel good about that. I will even react aggressively towards people that don't follow my traditions. So within my PhD project, we basically tested the interaction between diversity on the one hand and authoritarianism on the other. And I think this is really one of the key dimensions. There will be more individual differences, but also contextual. I'll talk about that later. But this one really determines if you think diversity is good or bad. So the research hypothesis basically was looking at the context. Is this context diverse or not? Or low in diversity and high in diversity? Looking at the person. Is this person low in authoritarianism or high? And then we looked at different outcomes. All forms of attitudes across our daily lives. Emotions, for example, do you feel positive or negative towards people with a migration background? On the political platform, we did a couple of studies on cynicism or anti-establishment sentiment, but also on party support. So we'll see that diversity also polarizes there with much more far right and far left support in those diverse areas. And finally, we looked at neighborhood attitudes as well. How do you feel about your neighborhood? Do you think it's a good neighborhood or not? Do you want to move? And this is a hypothesis called the white flight. In the States, they introduced that like about 20 years ago to say that white people, if their neighborhoods become more diverse, they tend to leave that neighborhood. Say, we wonder, does everyone want to leave, or does it depend on who you are? What's your social psychological makeup, so to say? And I'll present to you some of the results. And this, for example, is it's not the actual data, but it shows you how the relationships are, or what we can typically find. So basically, on average, we see that diversity is not really related to more or less anxiety and mistrust were the variables here, but it really depends on the person. So you can see for low authoritarians, there's zero effects, or even slightly positive, like the more diversity is related to less mistrust and less threat and less anxiety. For high authoritarians, there's a strong positive path. So really, the combination of something contextual, ethnic diversity, and something personal, authoritarianism, makes like a poisonous cocktail. So people that are authoritarian and that live in diverse neighborhoods tend to react most negatively towards that. This is the type of interaction effect I'll show you later, we'll find many times, and also other colleagues using different individual variables have found this. This is very similar findings that we did in a study in the Netherlands. Like I said, we have political cynicism, so the idea that all politicians are corrupt, for example, and politics do not represent the common people anymore. It's very close to what others are calling populism. And then, I don't know if you know this person. He's the leader of the far-right party in the Netherlands, Partij voor de Vrijheid, Party for Freedom. Geert Wilders is his name. He looks a bit like Donald Trump, and some of his statements about immigration, are close to what Trump also used. There's been a legal case against him because, like some of the statements were promoting aggression towards newcomers in the Netherlands. He won that case basically. But he's a controversial figure, and we could basically see the same effect. The people that are supporting him the most are people that are authoritarian and that are living in a diverse environment. On a side note, we actually found the inverse interaction for traditional parties. So next to the far-right party, we also had like central, like more Christian democratic parties like CDA, Christian Democratic Alliance, and CU, Christian Union. And those parties, you could see that people living in a diverse environment that are authoritarian tend to support them to a lower extent. If people live in a homogeneous environment, like along all other fellow white Dutch people, then the natural tendency for authoritarians is to follow or to support religious central right parties. But you can see they move towards the extremes when they are confronted with diversity. And diversity, I think, or immigration is one of the topics that populists or far-right parties use, along with other topics that are in their favor. And like if you look at the political alignments, there's immigration, there's anti-establishment sentiment, but there's also this typical conservatism that is used by discourses of far-right politicians. And I'm really curious if this replicates or how it would look like if you do a certain study here. Apart from authoritarianism, there's been other studies, for example, in Switzerland by Nicole Fazet, looking at conformity. And conformity there was also a moderator of the effect of outgroup proportion. And as you can see here, the outcome here was attitudes towards Muslim women wearing a veil. And you can see that there is a positive path for people. These are positive attitudes. So there's a positive path for people low in conformity. So diversity is related to more positivity or more support for wearing the veil, whereas you find a negative path for high in conformity. This is just to show you that this combination of diversity and individual, let's say, ideological variables seems to work as well in other settings using other slightly related outcomes. So let's end this part. We have like three parts that kind of overlap with the stages of my career. Like this is like, sorry, the conclusion of the PhD. Then we'll move on to the junior postdoc project where Herman was also involved in. So the conclusion here would be that diversity is neither good or bad in itself. It depends on the person. And the person really dictates if diversity for you has positive or negative consequences. So we see strong negative effects for high authoritarians and modest, sometimes positive, but often zero effects for low authoritarians. Like I said, there are other relevant influences as well on the individual level, but also on the contextual level. And here I want to propose the theory by Eric Uslander. He's a sociologist that said like it's not diversity in itself, it's the composition of this diversity. And he said, he pointed towards segregation as the main issue, the main problem with explaining the negative effects of diversity. So here, as you can see on these maps, these are like big cities in the United States. You can see that people tend to live with their own ethnic groups. So the colors here, I think, blue are Black Americans, yellow are white Americans, and the other ones are, I think, Asian groups or Asian American groups. So basically, almost naturally, people choose to live among their own kind. And like Los Angeles, for example, or New York, are very diverse cities, but people don't really get the chance to meet each other. So if there's no contact, which we'll see later, there's more room for threat, mistrust, because you don't know who's living on the other side of town. So we did some studies on that as well, and we found some support for Uslander, but actually only on the perceived dimensions of diversity and segregation. What we did was also in a large study in the Netherlands, we looked at 4 predictors, so objective or actual diversity, objective or actual segregation, and then the perceptions of diversity, the perceptions of segregation, so subjective segregation. We looked at the 3 typical Putnam outcomes when we talk about social cohesion, generalized trust, in-group trust, and out-group trust, and then we looked at all the possible interaction effects there. In general, we only found one significant interaction effect. So diversity and segregation, their objective and subjective forms, did not really predict generalized and in-group trust, but when we look at out-group trust, we did not find the interaction between actual and perceived, actual diversity and actual segregation. But when we look at those perceptions, we find the same effect as we've been finding along the way. What happens here is that if you perceive a lot of diversity in your neighborhood or your city, and you perceive simultaneously high levels of segregation, you trust other groups to a lower extent. All of the other combinations are not significant, showing that actually, well, the meta-analysis kind of was right, because diversity in itself is neither good nor bad, but if you perceive a lot of, let's say, segregation, then you find these effects. So on the right, you can see like all of the combinations of what low and high segregation is, what high and low diversity is. Because if we look, for example, at the upper left panel, high diversity and high segregation is super clear that there's almost separate neighborhoods in this fictitious city. Low segregation means that there's more a mixture. People live crisscross across each other. So we're doing some experimental studies on this as well at the moment. I'm hoping to come back later to show you these results, because we're curious if this will replicate also using other analytic methods. So I try to update the conclusion now to say that diversity is neither good nor bad in itself. It depends on the individual, but it also depends on other contextual influences, such as segregation, and especially also the psychological perception of what the segregation is. So it seems like diversity is polarizing, and if we want to make a diverse society or diverse communities work, we have to work on it ourselves. So diversity is truly a verb, and I'll always show this picture that we're like on a thin line together, and somehow it's easy to fall off, but we have to make it work. And what I will do now is try to discuss some tips and tricks on what we should consider when we try to create the conditions for more harmony in diverse societies. Because I would say that the original pessimism has faded away. Diversity is not bad across the board, but still, for some people, and we shouldn't ignore that part of the population, it might have negative consequences. So we want to focus on how to bring on board this segment of the population so that also they react towards diversity with either neutrality or more harmonious attitudes towards other groups. One critical issue is we should avoid segregation. And it's a natural tendency. They call that the homophilia principle, where you like others that look like you. And it's only natural, or it's a very natural tendency to go and live, or to go and sit, or to go and have interactions with people from your own ethnic cultural group. These are a few interesting and very popular papers. This is an article by Ananti Al-Ramia that was published a couple of years ago, and it's the title is "Why Are All the Asian Kids Sitting Together?" And she did like a cafeteria study where she took like pictures of where the kids were sitting down at lunch, and almost naturally, you cannot really see it here, like the Asian British children were sitting together on the table, and also repeatedly over time they had their own spots in their own groups, but also the white kids at school had like their own little groups, and there's even different corners where you knew you couldn't go. So same actually in a famous study by Dixon and Durkheim. They took pictures of beaches here in South Africa. I don't know which beach that is, to be honest. But there they also labeled the colors, and it's not super visible, but you could clearly see that even after, because it was a study done like recently after apartheid, where the beach was allowed for everybody, you could see that black South Africans were sitting together, colored white people as well. And I had a really motivated intern that created a game. That's a screenshot of that. It's like a bit like The Sims, and he did this for his internship. And the basic question was like, hello, here's the neighborhood. You can choose where you want to live, so that's the M, the me, and you can use the keys F and J, for example, to say if you want to live with in-group members or out-group members. So this is a free task, and you can see, do people choose diversity in their neighborhoods? And if they do, are they self-segregating? And for both questions, the answer is yes. So in general, people wanted some diversity, at least the average was 40%, probably because they were students and have been confronted with diversity already in their lives. Yes, I saw that my face was not really visible for the online people. It will be an interesting YouTube video to watch. But in this task, we also saw almost natural segregation. So people, if they chose diverse neighborhoods or to create diverse cities, they also wanted like out-group members to live, let's say, on the corner next to the little forest over there. But they didn't want them around themselves. We did some variations on that, and it's something that repeats. And it's something that is present among all of us, but the tendency or the magnitude of this tendency is much bigger among people that are prone to prejudice. Like it's related to individual differences such as authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, subtle racism, etc., etc. So this is this big barrier that we have to overcome, because if we don't do nothing, if we don't do anything, people will choose to live among their own kind. And I really wonder, for policymakers, how can you deal with that? And it's an open discussion that we can have later on. In Singapore, they had a nice experiment that they did where they forced integration. So in all of the apartment blocks there, the people that live there have to represent statistically the numbers that are living in Singapore as a whole. So in each apartment, there's, I'm inventing the numbers now, 40% people with Chinese heritage, 40% with Indian heritage, etc., etc. So I think there were 4 big groups there, and they really try to force multiculturalism, or at least societal or local diversity in those neighborhoods. Not sure if that's the way to go, if that's a success story. My supervisor also did like a study on that, and he found that the people that support this this governmental decision the most are authoritarians. Kind of makes sense because they always support the leaders, or they support political decisions, so they also tend to support that the government is promoting diversity. That's just one way to think about it. Secondly, we shouldn't forget identities, and identities is a very complicated and complex phenomenon. I'm not a social identity expert, but I want to hear it from you as well. how can you create like a harmonious multicultural society, or I should say diverse society? How can you make those connections and bring unity and social capital, to use the words of Robert Putnam? We have to at least consider those identities and what type of society we want. And it makes me actually think back now about the Mandela era, where he proposed the rainbow nation as a solution and proposed a new flag, etc. And I think he said, like, we should not live in a mono society where there's one group of culture that has all the power and the others are actually outside of society. We should try to create like something multicultural where each of the groups are welcome at least, but they have to stay next to one another, no mixing. And as a third option would be to really fuse all of the existing cultures. I'm not sure actually what Mandela had in mind. Probably it's somewhere in between the second and the third figure, but definitely not this one, because that's what basically the apartheid era was. I see that the stimulus materials are in Flemish, but yeah, maatschappij I think is the same word in Afrikaans, and then culture is culture. But we did, or at least with a colleague, we did some studies on these ways to create local identities. And the third option, the culture fusion, was very threatening. And especially for people, again, high in authoritarianism, this, you can think about that, but you can propose that as a way to unite a country or a local area, but know that there will be very negative reactions from actually the people that would also tend to have all of the negative consequences of diversity. So it's a very tricky story, and I'm open to elaborate on this with you further to see how can we make it work. So these two first tips that I gave might work, but we should consider them with care, I would say. The third one, I'm much more confident because we're looking, or I'm invited by one of the most famous contact researchers in South Africa, together with Dixon and Durkheim, and very good friends apparently. The third option, or the third tip or trick to promote to make diversity work, would be to stimulate intergroup contact experience, because we know, and that's one of the statements that I can, is that an expression, put my hand in the fire for that. Contact is a powerful medicine against prejudice. And what we'll show you now, I've been talking about the area where I live most of the time, like Western Europe. Here, I'll present a project that I did together with Herman. We were both actually together with Maus Houston leading this very ambitious project. And it's a meta-analysis looking at contact. This is not the first meta-analysis, of course, but also taking into account potential critical moderators of this effect. So I don't think I have to explain this to this audience, but intergroup contact is defined as interactions between members of different social groups. In 1954, there was the critical work, the book written by Gordon Allport, that says contact will reduce prejudice. And 50 odd years later, Tom Pettigrew and Lyndall Trump have published like the first meta-analysis, and a couple ever since, that show it's a robust effect. This one will become a bit more technical with a lot of numbers. I've just showed you figures before. This one will be more number-wise. But the average correlation coefficient, minus 0.22, is something that we can consider, at least in social psychology, to be modest to large. So yes, contact, I think in terms of effect size, it's almost the same as, because Ms. Reimer told me that, as the relationship between smoking and having lung cancer. We all know that it's increases the risks of getting it, but it's not a one-on-one relationship. It's a bit the same with contact and prejudice and tolerance. So this meta-analysis was done on a lot of samples and on a lot of targets and settings, and across the board, contact seemed to work. There have been some critiques to the theory, and I think some of these critiques are at least justified, and some of them, or actually most of them, came from this country. And contact theory, at least from 2005 onwards, has needed a reality check, and a lot of people wanted to put that theory to the test. And for example, Dixon, Durkheim, and Chedou, I've showed you the Beach paper, but they also had a lot of studies on contact that didn't find these large and positive effects. they said really not everyone is the same. So maybe contact might not work for certain individuals. They basically also said it might not work in some countries with an extremely hostile intergroup history, such as this country. Not every context is the same as well. There's been generations of different groups living here in South Africa, so that's one, combined with new flow of immigrations as well. Whereas, for example, in Western Europe, the immigration started a bit later and has been also like going up and down in terms of the numbers of newcomers arriving. So even though in Belgium, right at the moment, we also use the terms newcomers and oldcomers to refer to people that are third, fourth, or even fifth generation already. So these contextual differences might shape contact effects. And finally, there was the work by Fiona Barlow about the contact caveat, who said that negative contact can have much stronger effects on improving or increasing prejudice than positive contact has on reducing it. So negative contact, but also low quality forms of contact, are supposed to be very detrimental. There's been follow-up work by Steffi Graf and colleagues showing that actually that is true, but positive contact experiences are much more frequent. Although she used, I think, the term that if you have 7 positive intergroup encounters, 1 negative intergroup encounter can destroy all of these effects of the 7 previous ones. So it's important to take into account individuals, context, and types of contact, which is what we try to do. So how do we start? We have 3 key questions here in this project, and the first one is the most important one. Does everyone benefit from contact, or are there individual differences? We know, for example, with diversity, you have to look at individual differences. Well, here as well, we were wondering what about people feeling threatened by other social groups. This is particularly relevant for advantage group members, but also for disadvantaged group members, of course. So a first research question was, is threat a moderator of contact effects? And are contact effects significant even among people perceiving a lot of threat? For people of minoritized groups or disadvantaged or stigmatized groups, it is also important to consider discrimination. And there, the research question was, is discrimination a significant moderator? And do we still find positive effects of contact, even among those perceiving a great deal of discrimination? These are the 2 key questions. But because we did a meta-analysis and we invited people to send us their data, we had data from all over the world. So we could also consider the second question. Does contact still work in countries that have a particularly hostile intergroup climate? Here we were able to address also one of the issues with psychology in general, that most of the samples, like more than 90%, are coming from weird countries, so Western, educated, industrialized, Here we also had countries like South Africa, for example, that are considered to be non-weird. So do we find significant and positive contact effects there? And then another point that Linda Truck raised was a lot of the research on contact is looking at the majority perspective, but what about minority members? So we were able to address this as well and to investigate if contact had positive effects even for people of disadvantaged or stigmatized groups. And then to address the question of what types of contact do work, do we find that negative contact has stronger negative effects than positive? What about friendships, for example? We know that friendships are these types of intimate and repetitive interactions are much more powerful to change our attitudes. So this was like the range of types of contact that we also tried to take into account in the meta-analysis. So when you do meta-analysis, you can do actually moderation analysis within the sample to say, does actually the country, for example, or in this particular example, the type of contact, does it moderate the strength of the effect that you find? So we sent a call and we contacted a lot of scholars in intergroup contact research to ask if anyone had data available that met our criteria. These criteria was, well, the sample or the data needed to have a measure of contact. It could be any type. At least one of the 2 moderators had to be included, so threat or discrimination or both. we needed like at least one attitudinal outcome measure, and then afterwards we were able to distinguish actually 3 types, like outgroup warmth for positivity towards an outgroup was one type, trust was a DV, dependent variable that was taken into account a lot, and then prejudice, and often there was subtle prejudice as well. So the sample had to be, it could be from advantaged or disadvantaged group members, or sometimes it was both. And we also had a set of longitudinal data, so people that collected at least 2 waves, which is important because one of the claims of contact theory is also that along the way or across time, contact would predict more tolerance and less prejudice. So in the end, we were able to include 34 studies with 64,000 individuals nested in several subsamples and across 19 countries. So this is really a critical test of at least part of the contact theory. Again, a very small table, sorry for that. This is part of the supplemental materials, actually the first page of a 222 page supplemental materials where we report each of the individual analysis that we performed. And the list goes on. I ordered them here in alphabetical order of the main or the first authors of the papers. We do, that's important, have some data from South Africa, and I'll focus especially on these as well. And as you can see, there are a lot of samples, subsamples. Some of the samples had at least also disadvantaged groups included. Some of the samples, as you see here, were longitudinal. And there were various types of contact and types of outcomes that were considered. And each time you can see that the majority of studies looked at threat, but there were also some for discrimination as well. So this is a sample that I selected, a subsample, 29, so of the, I don't know how many, 34. These are data from 2014 when I did a research internship or a visit in Van der Bijlpark and Northwest University. And we collected data there on campus with, well, the large majority were black students, but we also had some a subsample of white students. So we split the 2 groups to have advantage and disadvantage group members, and we ran some analysis. I will not bother you with all of these technical numbers, but what we did each time, and we did this in each of the samples, is looking at the effect of contact. Here, for example, is contact quantity, the effect of threat, and their interaction term. In the next phase, and this is critical for our hypothesis, we looked at simple slopes to see what is the effect of contact for people that are relatively low in threat, so -1 standard deviation below the mean, and then those that are relatively high in threat, 1 standard deviation above. You can see the unstandardized effect. For the meta-analysis, we standardized those afterwards, and I think most of you are able to interpret p-values. If they're below 0.05 means it's good, so you have an effect. And we see that here, at least in this example, contact does seem to work every time. So no matter if you're high or low, these effects are statistically significant. And I plotted 2 figures here just to give you an example. When you look at outgroup positivity here, you can see that contact for both low and high threatened people, more contact increases actually is related to more positivity. With trust, it's the same. Although here, I'm actually not sure, I think that's a black subsample. The level of trust to begin with is fairly low. So positivity is almost like at the theoretical mean of the scale. But with trust, we do see positive effect, but there's a lot of room for improvement still. So that's also a critical look at this part of the theory, I would say. More data. So remember, we had a lot of subsamples. In the end, we combined them together, and on the total set of, you can see here the effect sizes that are considered and the clusters that they were in. We were able to tease or to calculate the effect size of all of these effects. Like contact was 0.19, which is close to the 0.22 found in the Intergroup meta-analysis. Threat had a strong negative effect, so we know the more threat is related to less tolerance, I would say, or less positivity. There was, a statistically significant interaction effect, but bear in mind that on these big numbers or these big data sets, a very small effect is also statistically significant. So we should also point out, is it practically significant or not? And I'll leave it up to you to decide. But as you can see, for people low in threat, the effect size was 0.18. For people high in threat, it became 0.19. For me, this difference of 0.01 is not that important. For me, I'm reassured at least that contact looks like a promising solution, because for those high in threat, we still find a statistically significant and quite high effect. I'm coming back now to the second research question that we had, because we had a lot of data from various countries. We wondered, is there a difference in the effect between weird and non-weird countries? And the thing that I highlighted here shows you that no, there is no statistical significant difference, and you can see the contact effect size, for example, was 0.18. In weird countries, it was 0.20, so a bit bigger, but not statistically significant in non-weird countries. So also in weird and non-weird countries, we can see that the effects for high and lowly threatened people seems to be robust. Looking at group status, if you look at disadvantaged and advantaged group members, as you can see there, no significant difference. So contact has an effect of 0.19, for example, on average among advantaged group members, and 0.18, a bit smaller, but still robust and positive among disadvantaged group members. Type of contact did have a moderating effect, which we know from the literature. Certain measures of contact do work better. For example, quantity, like the mere frequency of meeting people from other social groups, had an effect of 0.14, which is a bit lower than the typical effect size. And for example, quality of contact had a bigger effect, because there we find 0.22 as effect size. So also friendships, 0.20, we know that these intimate forms of contact do work better. Positive contact had an effect of 0.22. Negative contact had an effect of minus 0.14. And what does this mean? This means that the contact caveat, at least here in this, well, there are a lot of data where we can test this. There seems to be, it doesn't seem to be that negative contact has more detrimental effects than positive contact has beneficial effects. In fact, here, the 0.22 and the minus 0.14 are statistically different from one another. So positive contact apparently works better than the negative effects of negative contact. And also reassuring that the final number, over time, contact has a positive effect on our attitudes. Here, 0.28 shows you that it's smaller, of course. Across time, a lot of things happen besides our intergroup experiences that can affect or change our attitudes. Is this clear for everyone? Okay. Finally, I'll show you what we found with discrimination as a moderator. Basically, same story. There was a statistically significant interaction effect with discrimination, but let's look at the actual numbers to see if it's practically relevant or not. We do find that for people low in discrimination, the effect size of contact, or at least in this subset of the data, is 0.20. For people high in discrimination, it's 0.23. So counterintuitively, people that have a lot of experiences with discrimination, and we measure discrimination, or the examples that we had looked at personal discrimination, but also group discrimination, like the feeling that your group in society in general is being stigmatized. We found that contact works even better for them, or at least it has a strong and positive effect. So all good news. Also in this subset of the data, we found that there's no difference between weird and non-weird, and all of these moderators come back. So no effect of group status, but there was an effect of type of contact, so high quality forms, friendships, etc., or doing a better job at improving our tolerance levels, etc., etc. Also longitudinally there was an effect. So trying to conclude all of that, because we started with very pessimistic outlook of, okay, diversity is not, it's probably going to be threatening, at least for some people. That's an important nuance. Let's see if contact could be part of the solution. And let's see if that's true, at least for some people also that are high in intolerance, measured by threat, but also that feel very victimized, or at least perceive a lot of discrimination. So coming back to our 3 key questions, yes, it seems that everyone does benefit from contact experiences. Yes, contact effects are robust, also in non-weird samples, also in countries with a very hostile intergroup history. And yes, we know that all types of contact do work, but high quality forms perform better than, let's say, other measures such as quantity. So to open up the discussion, I will not focus too much on these the food for thought that I shared here, because I had a feeling that I'm almost running out of time. But it's important, I think, for the future to look at contact theory, at least also in combination with diversity, and to try to explore the boundary conditions of the theory, because there are some that remain unanswered. We have looked at 2 critical individual moderators, but there might be many, many more. So we know that discrimination has an impact, even when you look at, both when you look at it personally, but also on the group level. So what else can we investigate here in terms of individual differences? Authoritarianism, for example, has been considered. There's some work by Christophe Dant, who was my co-supervisor in Ghent, who looked at the interaction, and there, on average, and that's reported in a paper by Rhiannon Turner and her colleagues, contact seems to work, especially for those that are prone to prejudice. So high in authoritarianism or need for cognitive closure. So this is what some people have labeled the enhancement effect. So even for those that are most prone to prejudice, we do find significant effects of contact. Of course, as I mentioned, there are other individual differences that we could take into account. Let's say, for example, diversity beliefs. So the belief that diversity is useful, or when you look at the figures about identity that I showed, does, for example, contact work even for those that are low, for example, in diversity beliefs. Second point that I want to raise for the group discussion is avoidance of contact. I've talked about this before. Doesn't mean if the present, well, if you've seen that the presence of diversity or the presence of other groups doesn't really mean necessarily that you will engage in interactions with those people. It's very easy, especially for people, for example, high in authoritarianism, to avoid intergroup contact. So how can we deal with that? Of course, we know that there are indirect forms of contact that work. We should focus more on the context. That's also a point that we can raise. Historical and political context of South Africa is quite unique. So hence, I think also the number of critical remarks on the theory that we have seen over the years from this area. So important to look at that. And finally, and that's something that I'm not an expert in, but I think it's very important to look beyond attitudes. We can change our attitudes, but does it really mean that we also change our behaviors? And a lot of collective action researchers have shown an ironic effect or a sedative effect of contact, that although contact increases harmony or positive attitudes, it might also, particularly for stigmatized groups, be related to lower collective action intentions and actually a false perception that there is equality in society. There's important work by Tamar Sagi, for example, that I think that paper is labeled The Irony of Harmony. And she really finds that disadvantaged group members, when having a lot of contact with advantaged group members, tend to have lower support for collective action. There's a recent meta-analysis, I think it just came out, by Niels Reimer and Nikhil Sen-Gupta, showing that these effects are there. They're not super strong. Let's say, I think it's minus 0.07. So it is a significant effect, but still the beneficial effect of contact on attitudes is of a different magnitude, I think of a larger magnitude. But we shouldn't overlook these effects as well. And one of the quotes that I often use in my courses on this topic as well is by Dixon, saying that contact theory should not state the obvious. We should actually challenge the theory. And I think that's also an important way to go for the field. So in general, some take-home messages: diversity isn't good or bad. well, we don't really know without looking at individual and contextual differences. Contact, is it good or bad? Yes, I think it is good, at least when we look at attitudes. But we should also try to move the field further by trying to have a critical look at intergroup contact, also in, for example, South Africa. I want to thank Herman for inviting me, and also all of these people that you see here that were involved in the big project. We started, like the latest part of the presentation, the meta-analysis, in 2017, when we had a coffee in Oxford. And finally now, so many years later, we were able to publish this. So thank you also, Herman, for inviting me. I hope it was an interesting presentation, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks. I think what I can do, here are my contact details, by the way. Feel free to write me an email. Maybe I can, yeah. So if there's online people that have questions, feel free to raise your virtual hand.
Jasper, I'll start with a question. So you mentioned you were talking about the effects of diversity and segregation, and specifically perceived diversity and perceived segregation. My mic on here. So looking at perceived diversity